Tonight, I am starting with the disappearance of Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student who arrived in Los Angeles alone and checked into the Cecil Hotel during a solo trip across California. She shared a hostel-style room at first, and after complaints about her unusual behavior, she was moved to a private room. And that detail would later become important because it meant fewer witnesses to her final hours. In late January 2013, she stopped contacting her family, and her parents realized something was wrong when daily calls suddenly ended without explanation. Days passed inside the hotel as guests continued their routines, and no one inside the building understood that one of the rooms upstairs had already become the center of a tragedy. A security camera inside an elevator captured her pressing multiple buttons, stepping in and out, and making erratic hand gestures, while the elevator doors remained open longer than expected. The footage spread online, and people speculated endlessly. Yet what mattered was simple and concrete. She had been alone in that elevator during those recorded moments. After her disappearance, guests began complaining about low water pressure and discolored tap water, and the problem affected showers, sinks, and drinking water throughout the building. Maintenance workers climbed to the rooftop, where several large water tanks supplied the hotel. And one of those tanks was closed with a heavy lid that required effort to open. When the lid was lifted, her body was found inside the tank, and the water that had been circulating through the hotel had passed around her for days. The access to the roof was supposed to be restricted, yet there were reports that alarm systems on doors were not functioning consistently, and that detail added to the timeline of how she might have reached the tank. The official autopsy later determined drowning as the cause of death, and her known diagnosis of bipolar disorder was listed as a contributing factor without evidence of physical assault. No clear sign of external violence was documented in the publicly released findings, and the toxicology report showed the presence of prescribed medication in lower than expected levels. The tank's height and the narrow opening suggested that once inside, climbing back out would have been nearly impossible without assistance. And that physical reality remains one of the most disturbing facts in the case. Her clothing was found in the water with her, and the lid of the tank had been closed when the maintenance worker discovered her. Guests who had used the water during those days later learned where it had come from, and that revelation alone transformed a missing person case into a haunting memory for dozens of strangers. The timeline showed that she had been alone on the rooftop shortly before her death, and no verified evidence placed another person with her at the tank. Her family demanded answers, yet the final conclusion remained consistent with accidental drowning tied to mental health complications. The hotel continued operating, and the building's history of prior tragedies resurfaced in public discussion, intensifying the grim reputation attached to the address. What makes this case unbearable is not speculation, but the sequence of real, documented events that placed a young woman inside a sealed water tank above hundreds of unaware guests. The second story begins decades earlier in rural Wisconsin, where Ed Jane lived quietly on a farm near Plainfield and kept mostly to himself after the death of his mother. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless, and he spent long periods alone inside a farmhouse that appeared neglected from the outside. In 1957, a local hardware store owner disappeared, and suspicion gradually pointed toward Jane after witnesses connected him to the store on the day she vanished. When people eventually entered his home, they discovered furniture and household items constructed from human remains, including bones and preserved skin. The kitchen contained bowls made from skulls, and chairs were upholstered with material that did not come from animals. Investigators later confirmed that he had exhumed multiple graves from nearby cemeteries, removing body parts and bringing them back to his isolated property. Inside the house, officers found a decapitated body hanging from the ceiling, and the condition of the remains demonstrated calculated preparation rather than sudden violence. Additional body parts were cataloged throughout the property, including masks fashioned from skin that he reportedly wore inside the house. He confessed to killing 2 women, yet the physical evidence showed a prolonged pattern of grave robbery and mutilation, extending far beyond those murders. The farmhouse had been transformed into a controlled environment where no one else entered for years, and that privacy allowed him to escalate without interruption. His crimes later inspired elements of fictional films such as Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the documented facts were already horrifying without cinematic exaggeration. Photographs taken inside the house revealed ordinary rooms filled with objects that had once belonged to real people, and the evidence confirmed that the acts were deliberate and repeated. Community members who had known him casually were forced to reconcile the polite man they greeted in town with the reality hidden inside his home. The property was eventually destroyed by fire, and the physical structure that contained those crimes no longer stands. The remains recovered from his house were identified where possible and returned to families, closing part of a nightmare that had lingered unseen for years. The brutality was not random chaos, but organized activity conducted in secrecy. And the consistency of that pattern remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. He was later declared legally insane and confined to a mental institution for the rest of his life. And he died there decades later without ever living freely again. The farmhouse became a symbol of concealed horror in rural America, and the simplicity of its exterior made the discoveries inside even more shocking. People often focus on the grotesque artifacts, yet the true tragedy lies in the fact that real victims were reduced to materials inside a private obsession. This case demonstrates how isolation combined with fixation can evolve into irreversible harm, and it stands as a documented example preserved in historical archives. The final case returns to Los Angeles, where Michael Gargiulo lived among ordinary residents while carrying out nighttime attacks between 2001 and 2008. He presented himself as a friendly neighbor and a skilled handyman, and that access allowed him to move comfortably through apartment complexes without raising immediate suspicion. His first known victim was found stabbed repeatedly inside her home, and there were no signs of forced entry that suggested a violent break-in. Years later, another young woman was attacked in her own apartment, and the brutality of the stabbing indicated close physical proximity and sustained force. In one incident, a victim survived after fighting back, and she later described waking up to a man standing over her bed with a knife. That confrontation created the first clear interruption in his pattern, and it established that he was willing to strike while victims were asleep and defenseless. The attacks occurred late at night, and entry points often included unlocked windows or doors that allowed silent access. He blended into daily routines during daylight hours, and neighbors recalled casual conversations that now carry a darker meaning. Physical evidence eventually connected multiple crime scenes to the same individual, and the pattern of late-night entry, followed by repeated stabbing, remained consistent. One victim attempted to crawl outside after being wounded, and she collapsed on the walkway of her apartment complex, where neighbors later found her. The violence was direct and personal, leaving little doubt about the intent behind each attack. In 2019, he was convicted for multiple murders in California, and he received a death sentence after the jury reviewed the documented evidence. The verdict confirmed that the same man had been responsible for a series of killings that spanned years and crossed state lines. Families of the victims described the lasting impact of losing daughters in places that were supposed to be secure, and their statements reflected permanent damage that cannot be reversed. The apartments where the attacks occurred were ordinary residential units, and nothing about their layout suggested they would become crime scenes. Survivors carried scars that remain visible reminders of how close they came to death, and their testimony solidified the timeline of events. His outward normalcy allowed him to avoid detection for years, and that fact remains deeply unsettling for anyone who values routine safety. Each attack escalated in boldness, and the willingness to enter occupied homes demonstrated increasing risk tolerance over time. The legal outcome closed the chapter publicly, yet the emotional consequences continue for those connected to the victims. These three cases are not legends or exaggerations, but documented events recorded by credible sources and preserved in public records. Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.